are not doing the other operations. We can do the other operations, right? We can do the other operations. We can do, meaning parallel you can perform. We can download video will be downloaded, and another thing you can perform other operations you can perform. Basically, there are some lot of disadvantages are there in this approach. That's why what happened is from Android 3.0 onwards, from Android 3.0, if any logic is taking some time to process, from Android 3.0, if any logic is taking some time to process, if any logic is taking some time to process from Android 3.0, if any logic is taking some time to process, mainly which logic will take some time to process? Network calls. Mainly which logic will take some time to process? Network calls will take some time to process. From Android 3.0, if any logic is taking some time to process, the activity thread will not wait to complete the process. The activity thread will not wait to complete the process. Simply it is going to skip the process. From Android 3.0 onwards, if any logic is taking some time to process, basically which logic will take some time to process? Network calls. Which logic will take some time to process? Network calls will take some time to process, right? The activity thread will not wait to complete the process. Simply it is going to skip the process. To perform the long operations, simply it is going to skip the process. To perform long operations, create a separate thread. To perform long operations, create a separate thread or execute the current activity thread in the background. Execute the current activity thread in the background using asynchronous task. Using what? Asynchronous task. Okay, so from Android 3.0 onwards, if any logic or code is taking some time to process, simply the activity thread will not execute that one, because once if you wait for that particular process, your entire application is going to become slow. You cannot perform the other operations. You cannot perform until to complete that process. That's why mainly network calls will take some time to process. Okay, that's why activity thread will not allow you to execute that network calls in the activity thread. Okay, so that's why if you want to execute any long operations, if you want to execute, so either you had to create a separate thread you had to create, or execute the current activity thread in the background using asynchronous task. But here there are few disadvantages with the separate thread. These are the two solutions, right? Either you can create a separate thread you can create, or execute the activity thread in the background using asynchronous task. Okay, these are the solutions. Either you can create a separate thread you can create, what? A separate thread you can create, or you can execute the activity thread, you can execute in the background using what? Asynchronous task. You can execute the activity thread you can execute in the background using what? Asynchronous task. But the problem of creating a separate thread is nothing but we cannot communicate with activity UI components. Problem of creating a separate thread is what? We cannot communicate with the activity UI components. From separate thread. This is a problem. Okay, execute the long operations in the background either by creating a separate thread or by using the asynchronous task. If you create a separate thread, problem is nothing but we cannot communicate with the activity UI components. We cannot communicate from a separate thread. I'll repeat again. We cannot communicate with activity UI components. We cannot communicate from a separate thread. Meaning, for example, my requirement is I want to upload some data to server. My requirement is what? I want to upload some data. I want to upload to the server. I want to upload the data. Imagine this is a server. This is what? This is a server. My requirement is to hit the server. I'm writing some code which is used to upload the data into a server. I'm writing some code which is used to upload the data into a server. Some code which is used to upload the data into a server. Okay. From server, I'll receive the response I'll receive from the server. From server, I'll get the response I'll get from the server. From server, I'll get response I'll get from the server. That response I want to show on a UI component, whether it is success or it is fail. I want to hit the server and I want to get the response I want to get from the server. That response I want to show on a UI component, whether it is success or fail. For this kind of requirement, you cannot create a separate thread because whatever the response you got from the server, that response you want to show on a UI components, right? That response you want to show on a UI components, that is not possible if you create a separate thread. If you create a separate thread, what is the problem? We cannot communicate with activity UI components. We cannot communicate from a separate thread. Okay. For example, if your requirement is just only sending the data to server, that's it. You are not expecting any result. You are not expecting from the server. From the server, you are not expecting any result. You are not expecting from the server. For this, you can use this separate thread. You can use. For this, you can use what? A separate thread you can use for this requirement. If you are not expecting any response from the server, for this you can use what? We can create a separate thread you can create if you are not expecting any response from the server. But if you are getting the response, if you are getting from the server, that response you want to show on the UI components, that response if you want to show on the UI components, definitely you have to go with what? Asynchronous task we have to go. Understood? If you don't understand, just you understand what is the difference between creating a separate thread and execute the current activity thread in the background using asynchronous task? Yeah. So basically, if you create a separate thread, you cannot get you can get the response you can get from the server. You can get the response, but that response we cannot present on the UI component. That response we cannot present on the UI component. We cannot present that response if you use a separate thread. So if your requirement is you are expecting the response on the server, but you don't have a requirement of displaying that response on the UI components, then at that time you can go for a separate thread. But your requirement is you are getting the response from the server. That response you are showing on a UI component. If that is your requirement, definitely we have to use what? Asynchronous task we have to use. Okay. Let's see what exactly this asynchronous task. Creating a separate thread means in my project, I have a requirement like I want to send the user location to server. In my application, there is a requirement. I want to send my location. I want to send to the server continuously. For every 5 seconds or 6 seconds, I want to send the information to server. I want to send. I'm not expecting any response from the server. I'm not showing any response on the screen. Just only requirement is send the data to server. That's it. Whether server is received the data and not, it's none of my business. Just my requirement is send this send this latitude and longitude user position to a server. That's it. In that case, we can use this separate thread because we are not getting any response. We are not expecting any response on the server. At that time, we can use this separate thread. But if you are getting any response, that response you want to show on the screen, then definitely you have to go with asynchronous task. We have to use definitely. Okay. So let's see what are the steps to work with asynchronous task. Steps to work with what? Asynchronous task. Steps to work with asynchronous task. The first step to create an asynchronous task is steps to work with asynchronous task. The first step to create an asynchronous task is create a class with subtype of asynchronous task is a class. This is the first step for creating an asynchronous task. What is the first step? Create a class with subtype of asynchronous task is a class name. This is the first step for creating an asynchronous task. It is an abstract class, meaning this asynchronous task is an abstract class. It is an abstract class. It is an abstract class having an abstract method called doIn background. Having an abstract method called what? DoIn background. So definitely we have to provide the implementation. We have to provide for doIn background method. We have to provide the implementation. Definitely we have to provide the implementation for what? DoIn background method. We have to provide the implementation. Okay. Next, third thing is following are the major methods in asynchronous task class. Following are the major methods. Following are the major methods in asynchronous task class. Following are the major methods in asynchronous task class. Mainly there are three major methods are there. One is on pre-execute is one method. On pre-execute is one method. Another thing is doIn background is another method. On pre-execute is one method. DoIn background is one method. Another method is on post execute is another method. These are the three major methods in the asynchronous task class. Following are the major methods in asynchronous task class. What are the methods? On pre-execute, doIn background, and on post execute. On pre-execute, doIn background, and on post execute. These are the three major methods in asynchronous task class. These are the three major methods in asynchronous task class. Okay. See, whatever the network logic you wants to call, whatever the network call logic you wants to call, write that network logic in the doIn background method. Whatever the network logic you wants to call, write that network logic in the inside which method? Inside doIn background method. In this doIn background method, we'll write that network logic. Before going to execute any background process, if you want to execute any pre-processing, if you want to execute, write that logic in the on pre-execute method. Before going to execute any background process, if you want to execute initially, write the logic in on pre-execute method. After loading the entire data, if you want to execute any post operations, if you want to execute any post operations, meaning after loading the data, write that logic in a on post execute method. Write the logic in a on post execute method. Okay. The first step is what? We had to create a class we had to create with subtype of asynchronous task. And it is an abstract class which is having an abstract method called doIn background. So definitely we had to provide the implementation for doIn background method. If you want to execute any pre-processing, if you want to execute, override the on pre-execute method. And the network logic will write in the doIn background. And once if your background process is done, write that logic in the on post execute method. Okay. Next step is this asynchronous task is a separate class. Asynchronous task is what? We had to create a separate class we had to create for this asynchronous task. And by default, this asynchronous task will not execute by default. Explicitly, we had to execute that asynchronous task, we had to execute explicitly. Asynchronous task will not execute automatically, will not execute automatically, it will not execute. Asynchronous task will not execute automatically. We had to execute the asynchronous task. We had to execute the asynchronous task from activity. We had to execute the asynchronous task. We had to execute the asynchronous task from activity using the following code. We had to execute that asynchronous task. We had to execute our activity thread using that following code. Your asynchronous task name, your asynchronous task class name is equals to new asynchronous task name, and asynchronous task object dot execute is a method to execute the asynchronous task. Asynchronous task will not execute automatically. This asynchronous task will not execute automatically. We had to execute the asynchronous task from activity using the following code. Your asynchronous task name is equals to new asynchronous task. Asynchronous task object dot execute is a method. So whenever you call this execute method, it's going to execute that asynchronous task. It will execute. Okay. So these are the three steps. Simple. Override the extends asynchronous task, override do in background method, and from where you want to execute that asynchronous task in that particular activity. So we'll execute that asynchronous task, will execute by calling execute method. Okay. So we'll create a simple application we'll create for demonstrating this asynchronous task. My requirement is I want to create a simple application I want to create, and I want to create a button called get image. Just I want to make a network call. Okay. What is the requirement? I want to create a button I want to create here called get image is a button. Get image is a button. When user clicks the get image button, when user clicks get image button, I want to hit the server. When user clicks the get image button, I want to hit the server I want to hit. And from server, I want to get the response I want to get from the server. When user clicks get image button, hit the server and get the response from the server. This is what it's a server. Hit the server and get the response from the server. Get the response from the server. That response I want to show an image view component. Whenever user clicks the get image button, whenever user clicks the get image button, I want to hit the server I want to hit the server, get the response from the server, get the response from the server. That response I want to show on a image view component. I want to show that response. Get the response from the server. That response will show on what? Will show on a image view component will show the response. This is the requirement. This is my requirement. When user clicks the get image button, hit the server, get the response from the server. That response will show on a image view component will show the response on that response will show on a image view component will show. Okay. So let's see how to do this one. Let's see how to do this. Okay. Let's create a project. Let's create a project. Let's start a new Android Studio project. Let's start a new Android Studio project. Specify the project name. Let's take my project name is AsyncTest is a project name. AsyncTest is a project name. I'm specifying. Asynchronous test is a project name. Next. Next. Take an empty activity. Finish. Async test is the project name I specified. So open your activity XML file, select this text tab, you'll get the XML code you'll get. So first take the main UI group as linear layout. In place of this related layout, first we'll take the main UI group as what? The linear layout will take the first UI group. And we don't require this tools attribute. And all this padding attributes and all you can remove. Okay. So for linear layout, additionally we'll apply one more attribute, that is orientation attribute I'm applying. Inside this linear layout, first create a button. Match parent, wrap content, and what is the text you want to display on button? Let's specify the text. I want to create a button called get image. Let's configure the click event. On click is equals to get image is a text I configured. Android colon on click is equals to what? Get image. So below of this button, I want to create an image view component I want to create. I want to create an image view component I want to create. Specifying match parent and match parent. Okay. So let's configure an ID for this. ID is equals to I'm configuring IV1 is ID I configured. Image view 1 is ID I configured. Okay. I created an image view component I created for displaying the image. Initially what we'll do is we'll place some dummy image we'll place. Initially we'll place any one of the dummy image we'll place in the drawable folder and we'll set that image we'll set programmatically. Initially you can place any dummy image you can place. Later we'll replace that image we'll replace later. For example, so you can take any image, but whatever the file you are placing in the drawable folder, it should not contain any spaces. It should not contain special characters. It should contain only the small case characters. Okay. Okay. Initially, I'm specifying this india.png image I'm placing initially. Let's place the image in drawable folder. India.png is the file name. India.png. Let's specify that image by using Android colon src is equals to add drawable slash specify the file name India. Okay, now see the design here to show you how it will display on the screen. We get a button called get image is a button and we place a default image we place initially. We taken a dummy image we taken initially. Okay, let's configure a click event here in the activity. We already configured on click attribute. We already configured for a button. On click is equals to get image. Let's create this method in the activity class. So public void get image, which is taking the view object as a input, which is taking the view object as a input. Now here my requirement is initially we specified a default image we specified initially. This India image we are displaying initially. But my requirement is whenever user clicks that get image button, I want to hit a URL I want to hit. I'm collecting one sample image I'm collecting, sample image URL. I'm taking some Android sample image for Android. Just we required some image URL, some URL we required. It may be any file URL, it may be image, it may be a video file, it may be anything. Basically, we required a URL. We had to understand how to call that URL. Okay. For example, I'm taking this Android Studio image. I'm taking. So view image, if you click on that view image, just right click on this, you can find the address you can find, right? Copy the image address. Copy what? The image address. Okay. My requirement is in my Android application, when user clicks that get image button, I want to hit the URL and I want to get the data from that URL. I'll repeat again. I want to hit the URL. I want to get the response I want to get from that URL. That response I want to show on an image view component. When user clicks the get image button, hit the URL, get the response from the URL. That response I want to show on a image view component. I want to show that response. Okay. So here in get image button, in the get image method, let's create the object for this URL class. Let's create the object for this URL. URL u is equals to new URL and specify the URL address here. URL u is equals to new URL. Specify the URL address, which URL you want to call. I'm specifying the URL address here. This is the image URL address we copied, right? I want to call this URL. I want to call URL u is equals to there is a class in Android called URL is a class. URL is a class for calling the URLs. Okay. Okay. So this whole logic will give an exception. We'll put the logic inside what? Inside the try catch. We'll put the logic. This logic will give an exception. We'll put the logic inside try catch. We'll put the logic. Write e.print stack trace. Okay. So we are calling the URL. We are calling the URL. We are calling. Okay. This logic is going to give an exception. So that's why we are putting the logic inside try catch. We are putting the logic. Okay. See, by using this statement, just will hit the URL, meaning the first statement will complete. By using this statement, URL u is equals to new URL, the first statement will complete. The second statement, we had to get the information from the server, right? The first statement, we are calling the server. At this statement, URL u is equals to new URL, we are calling the server we are calling. But from the server, we had to get the response we had to get from the server. Correct or not? We had to get the response we had to get from the server. For getting the response from the server, we had to call this method called u.openstream is a method. The first statement, we are hitting the URL. If you want to get the response, if you want to get from the URL, there is a method called u.openstream is a method. What is the method name? OpenStream is a method. See, what is the return type of this OpenStream method? Return type of this OpenStream method is nothing but input stream is a return type. Meaning, from the server, you will get the data you will get in a byte array format. Input stream means nothing but internally will contain the data in a byte array format will contain the data. Okay. What is the logic written? Just we create a button we created called get image. We configured the click event. Whenever user clicks the get image button, we are calling this method we are calling. In this method, just we are hitting the URL. We are hitting the URL and we are getting the response we are getting from the URL by calling this u.openstream method. We are hitting the URL and we are getting the response we are getting from the URL by calling this OpenStream method. Let's run the application. Let's run the application. If you get any exception, we are printing that exception. We are printing in the log. We are printing that exception. e.print stack trace. Open the manifest.xml, Android manifest.xml. In this Android manifest.xml, we had to add a permission here because we are calling the internet. We are calling, right? So we had to add this internet permission. We had to add in manifest.xml. Users permission Android colon name is equals to android.permission.internet. We are calling internet. We are calling a URL, right? So we had to add a internet permission. We had to add in manifest.xml. So let's run the application and see whether it is working or not. Let's run the application. So you'll get the exception we'll get definitely and see what is the exception we are going to get. So open the log. There is a tool called Android Monitor. In Android Monitor, you can find a tool called Logcat is a tool. In this logcat, it's going to print the exception information. It will print in the logcat, it will print the exception information. So it is loading. So you got the output you got. Okay, first I'll clear this log. I'll clear first. I cleared the log. I cleared the log. I cleared, and I'm selecting this get image button. I'm selecting. I cleared the log. I cleared. Now I'm selecting this get image button. I'm selecting. So click on this get image button. See, I selected get image button. I selected. I got the exception. I got here. I selected get image button. I selected. I selected get image button. We got the exception. We got here. See, what is the exception we got? The exception we got Android.os.network on main thread exception. What is the exception we are getting? Network on main thread exception we are getting. Meaning it is telling boss, you are writing the network logic, you are writing in the activity thread, the main activity thread. We are writing that network logic, we are writing in the activity thread, we are writing that network logic. That's what the exception we are getting. Android.os.network on main thread exception. Okay. So how to resolve this exception? That's what we discussed up to now, right? Boss, you are writing the you should not write the network logic, network calling logic, we should not write in the activity thread because the activity thread will not execute that process because it will take some time to execute that network calls, right? So simply it's going to skip that process. What is the solution for this one? Okay, network calls logic we cannot write in the activity thread, we cannot write. The solution for this one is create a separate thread. But there is a problem with of creating a separate thread. We cannot communicate with activity Y components. The response we are presenting on image G component. So that's not possible with separate thread. We had to create what? An asynchronous task we had to create. So if you want to create an asynchronous task, either you can create a separate file you can create for this class. You can create a separate file you can create for this class or within the same activity class or within the same activity class you can create an inner class you can create an inner class you can create I'm creating a class called class my task extends asynchronous task. Okay, what is the first step for creating an asynchronous task? Create a class. I'm creating an inner class. I'm creating in the same activity class. In the same activity class I'm creating an inner class. I'm creating class my task extends asynchronous task. This is the first step. This is the first step. We had to create a class we had to create with subtype of asynchronous task. We had to create a class we had to create with subtype of what? Asynchronous task. See here it is showing an error. When you're extending an asynchronous task, it is showing an error, it is showing here. See what is error? Error is nothing but was you are extending an abstract class. We are extending what? We are extending an abstract class we are extending. That abstract class contains an abstract method called doIn background. Just click on this error. Click on this error. It will ask you to provide the implementation for one method. Click on this error mark. It will ask you to provide the implementation for one method. That method is nothing but doIn background is a method. Click on that error and select this implement methods. Click on that error and select this implement methods. There is an abstract method. There is an abstract method in this class called doIn background is abstract method. What is the method name? DoIn background is the abstract method. So we had to provide the implementation. We had to provide the implementation. We had to provide for this doIn background method. We had to provide the implementation. We had to provide the implementation for what? For this doIn background method, we had to provide the implementation. Okay. Whatever the logic you wants to call, this logic is there, right? This network calling logic. Move the logic from here to doIn background method. Understood? Whatever the logic you created, whatever the logic you written in the activity thread, whatever the logic written in the activity thread, move that logic into which method? Into doIn background method. That's it. Wherever you have a requirement of calling that asynchronous, wherever you have a requirement of calling this URL and get the response. So from whenever user clicks the get image button, we want to call the URL, right? So create the object for the asynchronous task. My task is equals to new my task, and your asynchronous task object dot execute is a method to execute the asynchronous task. Your asynchronous task object dot create the object for your asynchronous task, create the object for your asynchronous task class name, and asynchronous task object dot execute is a method to execute the asynchronous task. Your asynchronous task class object dot execute is a method to execute the asynchronous task. Okay, that network logic. Okay, it's a network call. That network logic we moved into the asynchronous task. We moved that logic, and from activity we are executing that asynchronous task. We are executing from the activity thread we are executing. But just we are getting the response we are getting here. Input stream ISR is equals to u dot open stream. By using this statement, just what we are getting? We are getting the response we are getting from the server. But whatever the response you received from the server, whatever the response you received from the server, from server you'll get the response, right? From server you'll get what? Response you'll get from the server. But whatever the response you received from the server, whatever the response you received from the server, that response we had to present on a image view component we had to present. Whatever the response you received from the server, that response we had to present on a image view component. We had to present that response on the server. Okay. For this, see at the time of loading the data, it's going to call this doing background. At the time of loading the data, it's going to call the doing background method. But when we can set this response to the image view component after loading the entire data. After loading the entire data only, we can set this response to the image view component, right? So once the data loading process is done, it's going to call a method call on post execute method is going to call. Once the data loading process is done, it's going to call a method called what? On post execute method is going to call. So we had to override this on post execute method. We had to override. Just if you call this on automatically, you'll get the support. You'll get auto completion support. We had to override a method called what? On post execute method. We had to override. So let's override this on post execute method. Let's override this on post execute method. Okay. What I'm doing is that response, whatever we got, that response we stored into this input stream object, right? We'll remove this input stream object from here. Let's declare a global variable. Let's remove this input stream object from here and declare what? Declare as a global variable in the asynchronous task. Okay. Now in the on post execute method, we are getting the response we are getting. That response we stored into input stream. That response we stored into what? Into input stream we stored the response. Meaning input stream means nothing but it contains the data in a byte array. It contains the data in a byte array format. The data is available. But that data we had to present on an image view component we had to present. We got the response we got. That response we stored into input stream. Input stream means nothing but internally it will store the data in a byte array format to store the data internally. That response we had to present on image view component. So what we will do is we can convert this byte array in this input stream. This input stream we can convert into an image format. We can convert image or bitmap. So terminology is same, but both are same, image or bitmap. Let's convert that byte array, input stream into a bitmap. Bitmap is equals to, so bitmap factory dot decode stream of bitmap factory dot decode stream is a method, decode stream, and specify the input stream reader object. Bitmap factory dot decode stream of specify the input stream reader object. Meaning by using this statement, bitmap factory dot decode stream, by using this statement, we are converting that input stream. We are converting into an image format. We are converting. We are converting that input stream, we are converting into what, into an image format, we are converting into bitmap format. Set this bitmap to the image view component. So image view dot, the XML file we created, right? Image view component we created in the XML we created. Image view is equals to image view of find view by id r dot id dot iview1. Now set this image to the image view component. Image view dot, there is a method called set image bitmap is a method. Set image bitmap is a method. Specify the bitmap object. So what we are doing in the asynchronous task, we are hitting the URL. We'll get the response we'll get from the URL. That response we are storing into input stream object. That response we are storing into input stream, meaning nothing but internally it contains the data in a byte array format. It contains the data. Internally it will contain the data in a byte array format. That byte array we are mean that input stream we are converting into an image format we are converting. So that input stream we are that byte array we are converting into what? Into image format we are converting, and we are setting that image we are setting to the image view component, we are setting that image. It will not return any return type like bitmap or .png, .jpg. It will not return any return type. That byte array we are converting into a bitmap. Directly it will not write the data into a file, it will not write the data. Okay. If you want, you can write the data into any output format you can write. For example, now the data is available in this input stream format, the data is available. In which format you want to store, you can store. For example, I want to write the data into a PNG format I want to write. You can create in the PNG format. File output stream is equals to new file output stream of, you can specify the file path, you can specify file name dot, in which format you want to store, that is your choice. You want to store in a bitmap or PNG or JPG, you can store in which format you want. Okay. So basically here we'll get the response we'll get from the server in the image format, we'll get the response. So the byte array format we'll get that bytes we are converting into an image format we are converting by using this bitmap factory class. And we are setting that image we are setting to the image view component we are setting. Okay. Earlier we got the exception we got activity on main network on main thread exception we got. That's why we created asynchronous task we created a asynchronous task we created. We are executing the asynchronous task from our activity. So this asynchronous task contains three methods on pre-execute, but we are not doing any pre-processing. So doing background is a main method. Whatever the network logic you wants to call, write that logic in the doing background method. Once the entire data loading process is done, then it is going to call a method called what? On post execute. So we are converting that input stream, mean that byte array we are converting into an image format we are converting, and we are setting that image we are setting to the image view component we are setting. Let's run the application and see whether it is setting that image to the image view component or not. Let's run the app. It's loading still. So you got the output we got. I'm selecting this get image button. I'm selecting now. I'm selecting this get image button. See, we got the exception we got again. Even though you create asynchronous task, we got the exception we got. Again, we got the same exception. Network on main thread exception. See, we have not written the logic in asynchronous. We have not written the logic. We have not written the logic in a activity thread, right? We return the logic in asynchronous task, we return the logic, but still we are getting this exception, network on main thread exception. So we'll see why still we are getting the exception even if you write the logic in asynchronous task. Internet permission is there already. Internet permission we already added. The reason is nothing but if you are using the asynchronous task in your activity, basically if you are loading the huge amount of data, see, basically in my view it's a huge data only because it's an image. Minimum it contains at least 1 to 2 MB of space these images. So if you are loading some large amount of data, if you are loading, okay, by using asynchronous task, we had to add these two lines of code we had to add in your Android activity on create method. In our Android activity on create method, we have to add these two lines of statement we have to add, that is strict mode dot thread policy. See, the data is small. For example, you are loading some small text file you are loading. So if you are loading a small amount of data, if you are loading, basically you don't require these things. But if you are loading the huge amount of data, some large data, if you are loading by using asynchronous task, we had to add this statement. We had to add strict mode dot thread policy is equals to new strict mode dot thread policy dot builder dot permit or dot builder. So we had to add this statement. We had to add. I'll repeat again. If you are loading a large amount of data, if you are loading in asynchronous task, we had to add these two lines of statement. We had to add in the in the activity thread on create method and strict mode dot set thread policies. Specify this policy object. So these two lines of statement we had to add in the activity on create method. Meaning, if you are loading the large amount of data, we have to add these lines of statement. So basically, even nowhere you can find the description about this. But if you are loading some large amount of data, if you are loading by using an asynchronous task, we have to add, like we are giving the permission kind of thing we are giving for our asynchronous task to load the large amount of data. Okay, let's run the application. For small data, without writing these lines of statement also you can execute. But if you are loading some large amount of data, if you are loading, then we have to definitely we have to add these lines of statement we have to add in the activity on create method. Okay, so click on this get image button. Click on this get image button. So you got the response we got from the server. We are hitting the URL. We are hitting the URL and we are getting the response we are getting from the server. We are getting the response. Okay, this is an asynchronous task. This is an asynchronous task. If you want to make any network calls, if you want to make, we use this asynchronous task we use. Earlier, earlier for calling the web services, RESTful web service, and even we discussed the SOAP service also we discussed. For calling the RESTful service, we use that retrofit we used. But earlier, before that retrofit, if you want to make any network calls, definitely we had to go with asynchronous task we had to use. Okay. Maximum where we use this asynchronous task is network calls. For making the network calls, we had to use this asynchronous task we had to use. Okay, so understood. It's also one of the most important topic in the interviews. They'll ask you what is the requirement of using this asynchronous task. So clearly you had to explain this flow. You had to explain. Boss, this is a problem. If you run in the same activity thread, if any logic is taking some time to process, remaining the rest of the process has to wait until to complete that process, right? To execute the process parallelly, whatever the logic is taking some time, yes, definitely retrofit is better. But in all the places, you cannot use retrofit, right? In all the places, you cannot use retrofit, you cannot use in all the places. For example, when I was discussing about the SOAP service, SOAP web service calling we already discussed. At that time, we used asynchronous task concept we used. In case of it's a RESTful web service, then only we can use that retrofit you can use. In case of it's a RESTful service. But say it's in case of it's a SOAP service, it's a normal URL, it's not a web service, it's a normal URL. Then at that time, definitely you have to go with asynchronous task we have to use. Okay. So let's practice this in today's session, synchronous task concept. And the tomorrow class we'll discuss that fragments concept we'll discuss. I'm really sorry, Vanita, because basically I'll follow that flow I'll follow. Somewhere I missed. Okay. So tomorrow we'll discuss. Tomorrow we'll discuss that fragments topic we'll discuss tomorrow session. Okay. Because the time is also not sufficient to discuss that one. So tomorrow fresh we'll discuss this fragments concept we'll discuss. Then after that, after completion of these fragments, then we'll start the Android media package. We'll start. Okay. Yes, Ashwin, tell me. What is the doubt?